So my name is Wim Decorte. Some of you may know me from a previous presentation I've given, or maybe at DEF CON. So today I will use the Microsoft Graph API as an example for things that all of us will be involved in the future. So allow me to paint the backdrop a little bit before we get into the nitty-gritty of the actual API. The reason that I started exploring this particular API was from a client request. A client had an old FileMaker solution, and they were downloading all the email into the FileMaker solution, because that's how they did their workflow. They had multiple mailboxes, and they used the POP or one of the POP plugins to download the email. As we know, FileMaker doesn't have a native ability to download email, right? We have the native ability to send email either through the client or through the SMTP protocol, but we don't have one for downloading. But anyway, they were using a somewhat older version of operating systems and plugins and all of that, and they were in the process of switching from one email provider to Office 365, and they were having some issues with authentication, and because of the multitude of accounts that they had, the maintenance around that was a little cumbersome, getting the accounts and passwords all correct, so that particular users could get down or interact with a mailbox that they had access to, and not with others. But so I went out exploring, because these days, whenever we talk about integrating or interacting with another system, we start to think about APIs more and more. And something caught my eye as I was doing some exploration, and this was just before the Christmas break. And I have it here in this article, but really what it started was this, right? And this is a very interesting read from Microsoft that basically explains why your passwords don't really matter, that they don't offer any level of security these days. And in that article as well is a link to an announcement that Microsoft has made, where they are announcing that they are retiring what they call basic or legacy authentication for a lot of the old protocols. We're talking about POP, POP, SMTP, IMAP, all of these things. So they are not going to allow the use of a simple username and password for interacting with these protocols. I thought that was pretty interesting, and they announced that in the fall of last year. And then I noticed that G Suite at Google is doing the exact same thing. The thing in red there is their reaction to the pandemic, where they are going to postpone their restrictions. But originally they had planned for the summer of this year to retire that kind of basic or legacy authentication into those old protocols, right? And again, with legacy and basic authentication, I mean providing just a username and a password. Google calls it less secure applications. So if you have any solutions out there, FileMaker solutions that use Gmail accounts for sending email to the SMTP protocol, this is something that you have to keep in mind, because it is going away, right? So Google is doing away with it. Microsoft is doing away with that. And this is another article from Alex Weinert. He's one of their top security guys. And one of the reasons that they state that they want to do with that is what I'm showing on the screen right now, right? So it shows that these old protocols are causing them lots of grief, and not just Microsoft, they're causing Microsoft's users a lot of grief, and that includes many of us, right? So a lot of the security breaches come from these old protocols, where, again, a simple username and password is being used. If you're following the Soliant blogs to some extent, you will have noted that I have been posting a lot about using OAuth. And OAuth is what they call modern authentication, right? It's not the legacy username and password anymore. It's a more modern version of authenticating users. And a lot of my blog posts have to do with authenticating users into your FileMaker solutions. The same mechanism can be used for functionality that we construct from inside the FileMaker solution that needs to touch another service, like Office 365, or if you're using any kind of G Suites, either Google Calendars or Google Email or any of the other Google services, then it's the same thing where you can use or will have to use now OAuth to authenticate your users so that they can consume those services. So this is the backdrop of the why, right? And I will use the Office 365 API to outline the concepts of how do you go about, if you're inside a FileMaker solution and we are FileMaker developers, we want to consume those services. How do we go about authenticating into those services? And while I will be using Office 365, all of the core concepts that I'm using apply to pretty much any service, right? So they apply to Google, to G Suite products, to any other service really these days. They are all turning to OAuth, so the core concepts are the same. All right. There's one of my blog posts has this infographic here, which comes from the OneLogin team. OneLogin is an identity provider. Identity provider as in Ping, Okta, Auth0, OneLogin. So these are all identity providers that can help provide OAuth authentication full stop. They can help provide OAuth authentication, and they in turn can then delegate the actual authentication to things like Active Directory or any other identity store that you may have. And they have a really good infographic that sort of displays the flow of authentication methods, if you will, right? Where we come from, which is the original legacy basic username and passwords, across to and multi-factor authentication to completely adaptive and contextual authentication. So this is where we're going. And this is what we as FileMaker developers will need to embrace and understand, because we will be asked to do these kinds of things for anything that we want to touch that is outside of FileMaker that we need to integrate with. We will also, but that's probably the topic of another presentation, we will also need to embrace this for letting people into our FileMaker solutions, right? FileMaker has a great set of tools. Let's see, I have it in here. This is one of my more recent blog posts that has to do with authentication, authenticating users into the FileMaker solution. And this is a bit of an overview of where we are these days with all of the identity providers that you can use to authenticate your FileMaker users. So OAuth plays a huge role into that, and we are seeing more and more clients asking us to provide that, right? Because it integrates FileMaker and your FileMaker solutions into the larger ecosphere of what that company is doing. And they're not all huge companies that are going this way. A lot of the smaller ones go as well. All right. Any quick questions on that before I move on to the actual stuff? All right. All right. So when we're thinking of sending email from inside FileMaker or receiving email, but receiving email requires a plugin, the FileMaker tools only allow us to use that kind of legacy basic authentication that is old style now and that is being deprecated in a hurry, right? So if you look at the SMTP options that we have in a FileMaker script, we really only have the ability to provide a username and a password, right? So, and that's exactly the kind of thing that is going to go away. I do expect Claris to update the product line in the future to provide different ways of authenticating into here as these protocols get evolved to allow more sophisticated authentication methods as well. So, so we'll be on the lookout for these kinds of things. They're not there, right? So if you're forced to use OAuth for sending email or receiving email, or using Office 365 calendaring or anything in that OneDrive that we just talked about before the meeting, that is all not really possible with the native tools that we have that are built into something like the send mail script step. Now, OAuth across anybody who uses OAuth works in exactly the same way, and it's a multi-step process. Which makes it inherently more secure than just providing a username and a password and sending that off. It's a multi-step process where you take the user to the identity provider, to the one where the user will be authenticated at, right? Which is not going to be FileMaker, right? So we're taking the user and we're taking them, in our case, we're taking them to Microsoft, to one of the Microsoft websites where the user will authenticate. So the actual authentication doesn't even really happen in FileMaker. It happens outside FileMaker. When Microsoft says that this user is okay, that Microsoft knows this user and whatever credentials that they provided were okay, then Microsoft will send back a code, right? That's what FileMaker will receive. Then FileMaker will have to do the second leg here and exchange that code for a token. And once we have the token, we can then reuse that token for any of the API calls that we make throughout the process, right? So in essence, once we are authenticated, the end result is a token that we'll then have to provide on every single API call. And it's the token that will tell the API that we are authorized, right? So once you get past the authentication part, authentication basically says, this is who I am. The authorization says, this is what I'm allowed to do now that you know who I am, right? So the token assumes that, well, not assumes, it declares that you have already been authenticated, and it encapsulates your privileges, if you will, in FileMaker terms, your privilege set, so that the API knows that, hey, you're asking me for something, but your token says that you can't, right? So that's what the token will do. So most of that is a two-step process, right? We take the user to Microsoft, user authenticates, and the authentication on the Microsoft side can be anything that that account has been set up for, right? It could be just a username and password, but it could be completely passwordless, right? Where they use the Authenticator app on their phone, or they use one of these YubiKeys, right? So it really could be anything, any authentication form factor that is set up on the Microsoft side or on the Google side, whatever that service is, right? So that is the flow when the user is actually part of the authentication process. And I'll show you that how that works in the FileMaker file. And we have this demo file here. Now, because the user is involved in that process, right? We have to take the user to the Microsoft website where the user has to authenticate. You may be wondering, but how does that work if I want to do this server side? Like if I have a nightly schedule that needs to send email or retrieve emails or move files around on the OneDrive. There is a different flow. Let's see if I have, well, actually, I'll have to come back to that. But there is a different flow that is meant for these kinds of server-to-server kind of integrations, right? Where we take the user out of the equation, and it's really a server or a service or an application that is being authenticated against the Microsoft API, right? So we take that user out of it so that we don't have to worry about it. Let's stick with the interactive login, and I'll actually open the FileMaker file here. All right. You'll see this notification here to say, hey, your subscription, it's not my subscription that will expire. It's my token that I generated for the application that is going to expire, and I'll show you that in a second. The use interactive login, in the demo file, when I toggle this setting here, that's exactly what is going to force that flow where we have to take the user to the Microsoft website and authenticate, right? So since what happens here in the background is that I'm showing a card window that has the web viewer on it, right? Because I have to take the user to the Microsoft website. In FileMaker, the only way you can do that is by using a web viewer. So I have a little card window that shows the web viewer. You didn't really see the login. That's because I have already logged in through this web viewer today. So the browser, if you will, because the web viewer is the browser has remembered that I have already authenticated against Microsoft, and it basically makes that round trip for me without having me re-authenticate or enter my credentials and do all of that. So to make sure that we understand that entire flow, this is what the web viewer would show, right? If I was not already authenticated in the web viewer, this is what the web viewer would show, right? And as you can see, we are at the Microsoft website, right? That's where the authentication will happen. And the rest of the stuff that that is appended to that, let me break that down for you. That's what the URL looks like, right? We construct a URL that goes to Microsoft. This little thingy here, that's the tenant ID. That's my every Office 365 subscription. Underneath that is an Azure AD. So there is an Active Directory underneath your Office 365, and that UUID is the tenant ID, or is the identifier for my Azure Active Directory. And the rest is basically just the default endpoints, and we don't have to guess at that. That is all part of the Microsoft's documentation, that they say, hey, if you want to use OAuth, then this is how you construct a URL. The client ID is the application that I created on the Azure AD side, and I'll show you that in a sec. I'm basically telling I'm telling Microsoft the response type that I expect is a code, right? Because there's different flows with OAuth. We are using the authorization code flow, which is the default one. So no need to get too deep into that, but we have to specify what that flow is that we're using, which is give me a code back. Now, this particular part is part of the magic, if you will, right? Because we're telling Microsoft, once we are done with the authentication on your side, I need that code back, right? We have to tell Microsoft, redirect to a particular website. And what Microsoft will do is it'll do that. It'll instruct the browser to redirect to that website, and it'll append a bunch of query parameters to the URL, including that code that we're after. So that's what we're telling, that's the instruction that we provide here to say, hey, redirect to this particular website. Note though that I'm just using the regular soliantconsulting.com homepage, right? For me, that was one of my biggest blockers when I put all of this together. I thought that I would have to create some sort of like web service so that Microsoft can send that code to my web service, and then my web service would have to interpret that and do something with that. And that's not the case. So I'll explain that in a second. The rest really isn't that important. States is a random string of text that we pass along, that when I send it and Microsoft redirects, they will include that same state, which is just another check to verify that the answer that I'm getting is actually from Microsoft, because I told them what my state was. They respond with the same state to say, yep, we're in the same conversation. This is not part of a different conversation. This particular piece here is something that I added so that the web viewer or the browser that sits underneath the web viewer will remember my login states for a fairly long time, right? So that I can cut down on the number of re-authentications that the user would have to do. Right. So that's the URL that we construct in the web viewer. That's where we take the web viewer. So that'll be here. That's what the web viewer shows. The user will just authenticate. In my case, when this is my email address for my Office 365 developer account. When I proceed here, I am not asked for username and password. It goes to my phone with the Microsoft Authenticator app where I can approve it. So in my case, it's passwordless, right? So there's no password involved in authenticating me against Office 365. Now, the thing that happens when my authentication is correct is that Microsoft will redirect the web viewer to that Soliant Consulting website, right? That's all that it does, right? It just tells the web viewer, hey, load this URL. And by the way, I got a bunch of stuff here that I'll append to the URL. Visually, it's just the Soliant homepage. There's nothing fancy there. And that homepage does not have to have any logic. It's just the web viewer displaying that URL that Microsoft constructed and forced the web viewer to redirect to. So that's a key concept. So what we have when the authentication is successful is the web viewer showing a URL, and that URL has sort of like the same thing where you all know this kind of structure where at the end of the actual resource locator, like the server plus the endpoint, anything that comes after the question mark or query parameters, right? So at this point, the web viewer shows a URL with a question mark and a bunch of stuff behind that. And so one of the things in that bunch of stuff behind that is going to be something that says code equals and the code. So at that point, it really just becomes a text parsing exercise, right? FileMaker has the tools. We can ask FileMaker, give me the source for this web viewer, which in essence is the URL, right? So once we have the URL in a variable in FileMaker, we can just parse it. We can just split it by the ampersands and the question mark and see, go through those and say, do we have something that starts with code equals? If we do, then we have our code and we can do the second part of the authentication flow. All right. Any questions on that? So where we are at that point is this first leg in the OAuth authentication flow, right? We have taken the user to Microsoft. The user has authenticated. Microsoft has told the web viewer, hey, go to this URL, and you have your bunch of stuff. So at this point, I have my code. The second part of that is I have to exchange that code for a token. And let's see. Actually, I'll have to come back to this. This is all the good stuff on setting up the. There we go. Right. So that's what the web viewer would look like in my case, right? Because there's no username and password. It's just an approval with my second factor. And then I parse that. Now, the second part of that leg is now that I have the code, I have to make an actual API call to the Microsoft API to say, here's my code, please give me a token. And the demo file you can just download and take it all apart. This is a basic API call using the insert from URL with curl options. Nothing too fancy about it. And again, it's all very well documented on the Microsoft side. But that's what I get. The response is right here at the bottom in that screenshot, right? It's the response for that is a JSON body. And I'm showing it. This is a little application called JSON Editor. So it can show me the JSON in a bit of a tree structure. But that's in essence what I get back, right? I get a set of tokens really, but the only one that I'm interested in is the access token. The refresh token, I can get into that in a sec. But the access token is the one that I need to store, right? Because for anything after this point, every API call that I make, I have to provide this access token so that every API call, Microsoft will know, hey, yes, you're allowed to do that. Now, the other piece of information here is that the access token expires in, and these are seconds, the access token expires in 3,600 seconds, right? And that's a hard expiry. It's not like if you're used to the FileMaker Data API, it's not one of those where every time you make an API call, it gets extended. That's not the case. You get it, and it expires after an hour. So if you can make calls throughout that hour with that access token, and you'll be fine. If you make a call a second after that hour with that same access token, you'll get an error to say, hey, you're not authenticated anymore. Obviously, it would be a huge annoyance to our users if we would have to take them back to that web viewer where they would have to re-authenticate against the Microsoft website just to get that token, exchange that token for another, that code, exchange that code for another token, and then continue with that token, right? So to avoid that annoyance, that's where the refresh token comes into play, right? And all OAuth providers follow the same kind of rules. The refresh token is something that you can use to make an API call under the hood. The user is not involved in that. You make an API call to say, hey, here's my refresh token, give me a new access token. And then you get a new access token that is, again, valid for 1 hour, and away you go. The refresh tokens are I believe the default from Microsoft is valid for something like 90 days, right? So you could theoretically hang on to that. You could store it in your FileMaker database and track the expiry. I typically don't do that. When the user logs out of the file, I basically let go of both the access token and the refresh token, so that the next time the user opens my solution, they will have to re-authenticate against Microsoft from scratch in essence, right? So, but during their session, I will use the access token and the refresh token to make sure that they can continue to use the API without having to go to the Microsoft website to authenticate. As a developer, or I should say more as an administrator of the Office 365 account, you have some say in the length of these tokens, right? So you can stick with the defaults, which are 1 hour for the access token and 90 days for the refresh token, but you can change that. You can make them more restrictive if you choose. All right. So when I'm logged in, then the demo file will will show that. And what I have, the way that I store that in this demo file is I keep those in global variables. Now the demo file itself is set up to allow for multiple Office 365 subscriptions, right? One Office 365 subscription can have many email accounts, but you can also have many Office 365 subscriptions, which I don't think is going to be a fairly typical case, but when I started working with that particular client that I told you about, they did have multiple Office 365 accounts, one for each email domain that they owned, which was a little weird, but it is what it is. So what I'm doing here, I have a bit of JSON, and it's a simple JSON that has a key with the ID, the FileMaker ID for the subscription, and then the token for that particular user is in here. If the user was logging in with multiple user accounts, I could potentially have multiple of these tokens here, and I do the same with the refresh token. I also keep track. This is the numerical expression of a timestamp. So I do keep track of when the token expires, so that in my scripts, every time I make an API call, I do a quick check against this piece of JSON to say, hey, this particular subscription, the token for this particular subscription, is it still valid? Because if it isn't, I'll just quickly turn around and use that refresh token to get a new access token. And that's all very fast. The user doesn't really notice that I'm doing that, but that's how I manage the fact that the token may have expired since the user made a call for the last time. All right, so the demo file is set up with this interactive login, meaning that we will take the user to Microsoft where the user will have to authenticate. The demo file also is built to allow for that secondary kind of authentication where the user is not involved whatsoever, where we have authorized the application, if you will, and the application has a token, sort of like a master password, if you will, right? So the application has a token that we can use directly to get an access token, so that we don't have to ask a user to provide credentials or authenticate with a key or a second factor. So the demo file does both. All right, before we can do any of this, right, before we can do any of the scripting on the FileMaker side, we have to give permissions on the Office 365 side of things. So either you as the developer, or you'll have to ask your clients or guide your clients on the way to do this. They would have to log into their Office 365 subscription, like I'm here. And if they are the administrator, they can go to the admin panel, which is this one. And as I mentioned, all the configuration that you'll have to make have to happen in the Azure Active Directory side that is underneath every single Office 365 application. So it's a little hidden, but if you expand them, you'll find them right here, right? So that's the Azure AD that is part of the Office 365. You can sort of skip log into the admin panel of the Office 365 directly, and you can go to portal.azure.com directly. As long as you have the credentials to manage that Active Directory, you'll be able to get in directly. Now, everything that I'm going to show you here is documented step by step in that blog post, right? So it basically is a full guide on how to configure all of this. And if you're somewhat familiar with using Azure AD for authenticating FileMaker users or users into your FileMaker solution, it's exactly the same thing for the most part, except for the part where we give explicit permissions to use the Graph API. So Azure AD, what we're looking at here is app registrations. Now, and it's the same if you use this for letting people into your FileMaker solution. The notion of an application on the Azure AD side, and again, this is not specific to Office 365. It's the same with G Suite, and it's the same with other providers. You have to create an application in their environment, and the application is not an application like we think of application. It's not like a FileMaker solution or anything like that. It's really just think of it as a privilege set. That's what it is, right? It's a little bit of a misnomer. It's not an application. It has no functionality. It's just a vehicle for setting permissions and for getting certain identifiers. So I have all of these applications set up here. The Do We Cheat 'em and How, that's the one that I have for that demo app here for my subscription. So there's a couple of things when you set one up, and I mentioned in that URL that you construct to take the user to Microsoft, there was this big UUID in there. That's the tenant ID. If you have good eyes, you will recognize that as exactly what I showed you in the other one, but that's where you grab it from, right? So that's your subscription, if you will, for lack of a better term. The client ID or application ID, that is the application on the Azure side. So that's the privilege set, right? That's the vehicle that has the permissions. So when you authenticate a user to Microsoft, you have to tell it which of these applications that you're authenticating into, so that Microsoft knows what privileges to assign for the token that it eventually grants you, right? So that's what the application has an ID, and that's what the client ID here is as well. Yes. This is also where I set the redirect URL. So when I set up the application here in Azure AD, I have to tell it that when I tell Microsoft to authenticate users into, when that authentication is done, this is where I tell it, and now redirect the browser, tell the browser to refresh and go to this URL and then append the rest of your stuff to it. So that's where I have this one set up, right? So that's where the SoliantConsulting.com homepage come in there. This can really be anything, right? So you can put in there google.com, you can put in your own website, you can put in localhost really if you wanted to, although that has its own issues. It really doesn't matter what you put in there as long as it's something that the browser can redirect to, right? So there has to be no functionality on that URL whatsoever. It's just something that the browser can redirect to when the authentication is done. All right. So that vehicle that we create here on Azure AD has the ID. It also has, I have it in here, secrets, right? So the application has to have an ID. It also has to have a secret, because part of that flow, when Microsoft sends us a code and we have to exchange the code for a token, that API call that we make, we have to provide the secrets. That's the second part of that OAuth dance, if you will, that we at some point will have to show our cards to Microsoft to say, yep, I'm talking to this, I want the permissions for this application that I have here, and here's the secret, right? This proves to Microsoft that I hold that secret and that it's okay for Microsoft to generate a token that can then be used against the API, right? So I have it set up here. That's the bottom here. So that's my demo. Um, when you create, actually, let's see that. If you create a new secret, you can choose to let it never expire. Obviously, they really don't want you to do that. So for security, you have to pick an expiry date for that particular secret. And when I opened my FileMaker demo file, it showed you that expiry date. That's just a bit of housekeeping that you'll have to do as a developer to make sure that you track that expiry date. Because when this expiry date passes, no user can authenticate against the Microsoft API anymore, right? Because it really means that the application, the vehicle, the privilege set that we created on the Microsoft side has expired, right? Obviously, we can come in here, create a new secret, and then populate that wherever we store that in FileMaker, and away we go. We're good to go. But it is something to keep track of, that there is an expiry on these things. Uh, Once you generate it here, you cannot retrieve it from here, right? So there's no way that I can say, show me what that secret is. They show it to you once when you create it, and then it's forever invisible. Um, so it's one of these things that you'll have to keep in mind as you go about it. All right, so I have my registered app, which is the privilege set on the Microsoft side. It has an ID and a secret. So I know how to authenticate against that. And then what I really need is a set of permissions. All right, so I can do that, add a permission. So at this point, you'll have to decide what is it that the users need to do with the Microsoft API, right? Is it sending email? Is it reading email? Is it getting access to calendars? Is it getting access to OneDrive? So any of these things is what you'll have to assign here. And there's a bunch of stuff here at the bottom that we don't really care for. What we do care for is what they call Microsoft Graph. And I know it's a complete misnomer. I don't know why they call this API a graph. It has nothing to do with graphs. That's just the name that they picked. It's a little unfortunate, but that's what it is. Again, nothing to do with charts or graphs. That's just their name. Right? So we'll pick that one. Now, the next choice we have to make goes along that line of, do we as developers, obviously in talking with the business, do we only use this API after the user authenticates themselves? Or do we also use this API for any kind of background stuff where the user is not involved in server-side schedules and whatnot, right? So that's basically your permission choice that you have to make. If you want your app to have both, then you'll have to assign the permissions both. One on behalf of the user, and then once on behalf of your application, so that it can do its own stuff in the background without involving the user. So that's what these two choices mean, right? So if I say, as the logged in user, I can now look at all of the API that's there and figure out what permissions that I need. Now, the good news is that, where did I have it? Here. This is the Microsoft Graph API documentation. The really nice thing about it is that if I want to, say, list messages, which is nothing more than give me the list of emails for a particular user's account, right? And it'll tell you exactly what level of permissions that you'll need, right? So there's no guessing. You don't have to spend hours going through that API assignment thing. As a developer, once you go to the API and say, okay, this is the API endpoint that I need, it'll tell you what permissions you need. If you haven't assigned them yet at that point, you go back to your Azure AD, you go into your app, and you assign the right level of privileges, and away you go, right? So the API documentation is really well done. It's a good way. It also tells you the endpoints, right? The endpoints are important because, like any API, really, the first part of the URL is always the same. That's just what they give you. And then the endpoint is specific to the functionality of the API that you want to talk to. So and together with the permissions, they'll tell you if you want to get a list of the messages, then these are the endpoints that you use. And you'll see here too that there's two of them, right? The me endpoint is always when the user has already authenticated themselves. Then it's basically just me. It's my messages, my OneDrive, my whatever. If you are doing this in the background and you're doing this for users who have not authenticated themselves, but you're doing the server to server kind of thing, you have to specify what user it is for, right? Because at that point, the API doesn't know who the user is that logged in. You'll have to tell it, hey, this is for this user. So I want the emails for this particular mailbox, in essence, if we use this one. I have a question here from Jeff. They say, do some of the tokens go into the server somewhere? Actually, I'll show you what I do with those tokens. I guess I showed you with the global variables, right? So unlike the authentication into FileMaker server, those tokens, when I get a token on behalf of the user or as a user, it's merely me as a developer. Microsoft gives it to me as JSON when I make the API call to exchange that code for a token. And then it's up to me as a developer to store them, but they don't get stored on FileMaker server, and they don't get stored anywhere unless you as a developer make a decision to store them somewhere, right? And for me, I don't store them as data in the FileMaker file. I just keep them in that global variable because I want them to be gone when the user session is over. So I hope that answers that question. So if I go back to here, that's how I assign privileges, right? Like if I wanted to assign the user rights to read calendars or read write to calendars, so it's very fine-grained the way that you can assign those privileges. All right. So in a nutshell, and I know I flew totally over this, but like I said, the blog post has a complete step-by-step on how to do this in a lot of detail. That's all the work you do in the background. That's all the work you do on the Microsoft side of things to make sure that the API knows what it is that you are entitled to do. Now, if I go back to my FileMaker demo file, I just have the one subscription in here for now. And that's where I store the things that are permanent, right? This is where I store the client ID of my application, right? And again, application means that vehicle that I have over there on the Microsoft side that encapsulates the privileges on the Microsoft side. The tenant, in essence, that's my Office 365 subscription. It's the ID of the Azure AD underneath there, and I keep track of the dates, right? Because this particular secrets that I have over here that I store in FileMaker, that one expires on this date. I have to keep track of that. All right. Now, I am logged in as a user. So if I go to users, I will only see, that's how the demo file is built, right? I just show that particular user that is logged in. Because I know who, that's one of the nice things as well. Part of that JSON body that I get back from Microsoft is also the email address of the user, right? So as a FileMaker developer, I know exactly who logged in, right? Obviously I would know probably because they logged into FileMaker to begin with, but I have another check there that I know exactly what the user used to log into Microsoft. So I have their email, so I can just look them up in my list, because I have about 20 accounts, email accounts, not Office 365 accounts, but email accounts in there. So I can go there, and anything from this point forward is an API call, right? I can ask the Office 365 API, hey, give me a list of folders, right? And when I get a list of folders, I also get their email account that's in there. And so if I say, go ahead and collect me that. So these are just FileMaker scripts making the calls, and I'll show you how I structure my scripts. So I have 78 emails in my inbox. You can sort of see the evolution over time. Every time that you ask the API, what I do on FileMaker is I create a count record. I have a table for my folders, but I have a related table for my counts. One of the reasons for doing this is for that original client that I was talking about. They had some weird phenomenons where all of a sudden they would have a jump of thousands of extra emails in their inbox, and they couldn't figure out where they came from, right? So I created it this way so that I can ask the APIs without having to retrieve the actual emails. I can ask the API, give me the count of emails, and if there's a sudden jump, I can then send an email to somebody or do some warning or very carefully try to retrieve some emails without having to download thousands of emails. All right. And here I have the emails, and I can get the emails, right? So the API, the Graph API is so vast and has such power that now without using plugins, I can send emails. And not only can I send emails, I can send nicely formatted HTML emails without having to jump through hoops. I can attach multiple attachments in the one go. And I can download emails. I've never been a big fan of using plugins to download emails into FileMaker, but with this API, it's very easy to do. So I can just go and grab the emails. The same with the OneDrive, right? So in this particular demo file, I do email and OneDrive. So this is the one OneDrive for this particular account. And I can get a list of the files that are in the OneDrive. Again, because the API is granular, I can ask the API, just give me a list of the files. Don't give me the files, just give me a list of the files so that I can see the folder structure and what's in there. Let's see. Yep. This is a Word document that's in my OneDrive. I can then download it into FileMaker to do something with that. One of the functionality of the APIs, for instance, and just as a quick example to show the power, API, the Microsoft API has an endpoint to convert certain formats into PDFs on their server, right? So if I wanted to have a PDF of this Word document that lives on OneDrive, I have nothing of this on my machine at this point. Nothing on my machine, nothing on FileMaker server. I can then tell it, hey, calling the API endpoints and create me a PDF. So now I have a PDF of that Word document right there. So it's just one of the many features that the API offers that we can do. I have also this URL here. If I wanted to, I can click on that and my browser will open up, go to my OneDrive and go to that file. So it's very easy to interact your FileMaker solution. The same with email. If I go back to emails and I pick one of these emails, same thing, right? So I can open the same email in Outlook on the web and go to my mailbox from there. The nice thing about this, because I've already authenticated to the browser, chances are it'll go straight into that. I will not have to authenticate into that again, meaning the browser, because chances are that I have already authenticated. And I'm showing HTML email here, so that's kind of easy, very easy to do. And if I want to reply to that email, I can do that from here too, right? So the thing is, if I do anything here with text formatting in FileMaker, if I make this different font and a different size, and I want to do that, using the get as CSS function that's native in FileMaker, all I need to do is tell it get as CSS my text and add it to the body of my API call, and away you go, right? So I don't know if you've ever tried to send HTML emails to them through SMTP with the new curl options. It's doable, and we as Soliant have a great blog post that explains how to do it, but it's not trivial. With this API, it's entirely trivial. It's that simple to create an API call that does that and sends it off, and I can attach multiple attachments to here as well. All right. Let's see very quickly some of my scripting. And again, you can download this and take it apart. You'll see these functional blocks in my scripts. I have a functional block for each part of the functionality that I do, like the API calls to get the list of the email folders, getting the emails in a particular email folder. So some of these things. One of the things I wanted to show you is that because every single REST API call, whether I'm calling the Office 365 API or the Google API or any other API, all of these API calls follow the exact same structure, right? You have a URL, you have an endpoint. Sometimes you attach query parameters to the URL, or sometimes you create a JSON body, but it's always the same thing. So I always tunnel my API calls through these two scripts, right? So every single API call that I make goes to these two scripts. One of the beauties of that is that I can very easily log every single API call that I make. So this was the last one that I made. I have my request. So this was a post. This was the URL. These were the curl options. This is what Microsoft sent back to me, and I have the response code plus the full trace that I have in there. This is invaluable information when you're troubleshooting. And not just troubleshooting, but over time, when I revisit this client, I can then check to see how many errors did we get, or how long does it take? Is there any performance problems with these kinds of things? How long do these API requests take? So it's very, very, very easy for me to go into any of these solutions. So I have this API call log in every single solution that uses API calls for any service that we integrate with, and the same two scripts. And the rest is really a fairly simple structure where I make that call, right? So most of these, if you take them apart, when I make an API call to the Office 365 API, there's a couple of things that I need to check, and one of them is, do I know what subscription this is for? Because I mentioned this demo file is set up to allow for multiple Office 365 subscriptions. So I need to retrieve the proper token for the proper subscription. So that's what I do here. Then I validate whether the token is still valid, right? So like I said, it's a hard cutoff at the hour. So as a developer, I cannot assume that the token is still valid. So I'll do a quick check. And the way that I do the quick check is I basically just go check against my global variable that expiry date, or the timestamp to be more accurate, to say, is that still valid? If it isn't, then turn around and use that refresh token to get a new access token. And again, it sounds like a lot of work, but it's actually very fast, which is one of the beauties of using FileMaker as in this kind of integration tool. It makes these API calls extremely fast. And then I basically will retrieve. I have this preference table where I keep track of all the endpoints for all of the functionality that I'm talking to. Like in this case, the base URL and the route. So the base URL is just the Microsoft whatever it is, that it's always the same, and the route is the endpoints of the functionality that I'm talking to, which would be the thing that I showed you here, right? So these things, right? So this is what I call endpoints or routes. That's sort of like the terminology for these kinds of things. I store that in a preference table in FileMaker. And then I have to decide whether what authentication scenario am I working with? Is this the user having authenticated, or am I doing this on behalf of a user, which means I have to set the endpoint correctly. I do that new card window to show the progress. I update the card window, and I make my API call, right? So this is the same structure for all of my API calls. I set it up nicely, and then I make that call to that one script that I always call, that actually does the actual API call, gets back the result, logs the results, and then comes back to me. Now, the end result of any API call that I make is going to be JSON, right? I will get something back from Microsoft or from Google or from anybody that is JSON. Then I have to parse it. So any of these functional blocks, you'll see they always will have a parse script in there that will take that JSON and then take it apart. If it's a list of folders, I will then iterate through that, check to see in FileMaker, do I have this folder already? If I don't, I'll create it. If I do, I don't have really have to do anything. So that's sort of like the basic structure of any of these functional API calls that I make to Microsoft.
I want to thank everybody for joining us today for our first virtual CAFTA. And I especially want to thank Wim for presenting on using FileMaker with Office 365 and using the Microsoft Graph API. Don't forget that our next virtual CAFTA meeting will be next Friday, April 13th, and Chris Conger will be presenting animated alerts using native FileMaker. If you have any questions about the topic from today, please don't hesitate to reach out to us or Wim at soliantconsulting.com. Thank you.